event related to Indonesia. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event on the Indonesian elections. Tonight's event is a Sydney Southeast Asia Centre, or SEAC, event. And for those who do not know, SEAC is a multidisciplinary initiative of the University of Sydney. Here at Sydney, we have over 400 staff who work on Southeast Asia. And SEAC, amongst other things, brings them together to facilitate their research, outreach, and education functions. SEAC has 5 clusters, 5 research clusters: state and society, health, environment and resources, economic and state development, and heritage and the arts. And each of these clusters is represented in the panel discussion tonight. The Centre for Asia and Pacific Law at the University of Sydney Law School is also supporting the event tonight. Now, as you all know, Indonesia goes to the polls in just over a week from today, on the 17th of April. It will be the largest and most ambitious election in Indonesian history, and perhaps even one of the most complex the world has ever seen. In the past few elections, Indonesia's national parliament and regional representative council elections were held a few months before the presidential elections. And in the past, regional elections were held at different times throughout the year. This time, they'll all be held on the same day, thanks to a decision of the Constitutional Court in 2009. So this means up for grabs will be 575 seats in the National Parliament, 136 seats in the Upper House, which some people call the Senate, and of course the positions of President and Vice President will be up for grabs too. And more than 20,000 seats in provincial, city and county council parliaments will also be contested. Of course, a massive logistical exercise. The Electoral Commission is responsible for setting up about 800,000 polling stations. There'll be 5 million or so polling officials. And the Commission will also be responsible for providing up to 5 separate ballot papers for about 192 million registered voters, amongst other logistical nightmares. Yet, despite all this electoral activity, most commentators, both inside and outside of Indonesia, seem most preoccupied with the presidential elections. The parliamentary elections have been relegated really to the position of a sideshow, with the main event being a rematch between the current president, Joko Widodo, and Prabowo Subianto, the former head of Indonesian Special Forces, of course. They, of course, have new running mates this time around, though. Jokowi has the conservative Islamic scholar Maruf Amin, and Prabowo has former business person Sandiaga Uno. Now, last time Jokowi and Prabowo were up against each other in 2014, Jokowi won with about 53% of the vote to Prabowo's 47%. Jokowi led Prabowo for most, if not all, of the 2014 election campaign, but Prabowo appeared to significantly narrow the gap in the lead up to the elections. In 2019, again, Prabowo seems to be well behind Jokowi, and most commentators think that Prabowo won't be able to catch him, but we'll have to wait and see. Now, tonight we're not going to focus on logistical issues or what might go wrong with voting. Instead, we're going to talk about some of the things that really matter to Indonesians and to Indonesia's future, some of the things that really are at stake in these elections. And to this end, we've invited a group of highly engaged and interesting scholars to shine a light on some of these issues. We have Professor Michelle Ford, University of Sydney, of course, Director of SEAC, who will talk tonight on the cluster of state and society. We have Anthony Saspura, who is almost completed a PhD at the University of New South Wales. We have Dr. Jeffrey Nelson, who is from the Faculty of Science here at the University of Sydney. Russell Toth, economist extraordinaire, School of Economics, also from this university. And Intan Praramadgita from the Department of Media, Music, Communication and Cultural Studies from Macquarie University. Please join me in welcoming them to talk to us tonight. I'm going to ask them each a few questions, and then we'll open up for some general Q&A. Grab it first. Start with you, Michelle. Now, why is it important to think about the role of unions in Indonesia's election?
Now, not everyone's going to be thinking about the role of unions in the election, but as a scholar of the labour movement in Indonesia, I think it's important for a number of reasons. First and foremost, for a generalist audience, it's important because labour is a bellwether of democracy. The way that governments treat labour movements, whether they allow them to have freedom of association, whether they allow them to engage in political processes, is a sign of how democratic a regime is. It's also important because, we'll talk about 214 later, but in 214, Labour emerged as a serious force in the national presidential elections, and this was quite unexpected. The unions had never shown any interest, particularly in the presidential elections, even though they'd been quite involved at the regional level in executive races and had some experiments in the legislative sphere. But in 214, we had Prabowo, who was the losing candidate, come out very strongly in alliance with one of the confederations. And then the other two confederations supported Jokowi. So unusually in Indonesia, where elections are often a policy-free zone, in 214 we saw Labour platforms on both sides in a way that we'd never seen before. So I think 219 is really important because we'll see what happens to that trajectory, whether that interest can be sustained or whether it was simply a one-off in a particular situation.
Okay. And unions have played a much greater role since Reformasi. How important were they in the 2014 elections?
Okay, so by way of context, as many of you might know, in the Suharto era, there was only one official union and its purpose was to control workers rather than support their interests or represent their interests. And at 98, it was a really interesting time because suddenly you had the government saying, okay, we can have freedom of association, you can form new unions, unions can be more active, we won't put the same kinds of limits on worker associations. And you had a mushrooming of unions. Suddenly you had hundreds at the national level, and then of course thousands more at the subnational level. So those unions in the first instance weren't very interested in politics. They were mostly interested in trying to carve out some economic and policy space. And in that period, the main way they tried to achieve policy space was through mass mobilisation. So they'd take issue with a piece of legislation or a policy and they'd put their members out on the streets. And this was quite effective for quite a long time. But over time, of course, this is a very resource-intensive strategy. It takes a lot of energy. It takes, you can't keep getting your members out unless you're getting serious change. So they started to look to other mechanisms. And the regional level was really important at this stage because it was at the regional level with decentralisation that suddenly you had opportunities to influence local policy on labour. So they started engaging in the executive races at the regional level. Then they started playing around with legislative races, trying to get union-backed candidates onto party tickets. And then in 2014, this led to a situation where they did run some Labor candidates for the legislature, but perhaps more importantly for our purposes today, as I said before, they came out in a way they never had before behind the two presidential candidates.
Thank you. And what changes do you think we've seen in the power of unions in the intervening years?
Well, this is a really interesting question. When Jokowi was elected, a lot of human rights activists supported his candidacy, and for obvious reasons. Prabowo had a record of human rights abuse. There were lots of assertions in his rhetoric about a return to a less complicated time, and more authoritarian time. Yet, at the same time, Jokowi hasn't performed in human rights generally. He's performed on infrastructure, he's performed to some extent on education and health. The economy is in an okay position. But on human rights, which was a big part of the platform in 2014, he hasn't performed, such that there are really high-profile NGOs who are encouraging voters not to vote for anyone because they say, well, there's no good choice in 2019. Now, for Labor, I think, that, again, the Labor as a bellwether of democracy, we can see in the last 5 years just how policies can undercut a social movement. So the main thing that happened was a regulation was passed that changed the ways that minimum wages were negotiated, which really undercut unions' power in the regions, where, as I mentioned before, was really an engine of this political engagement. They also started militarising industrial relations again. So you had strengthening of vital objects legislation, which meant that industrial zones were suddenly being treated as national assets, like a nuclear power station, not that Indonesia has one yet, but like a hospital or a military centre that really couldn't be disturbed, and that allowed the military to come in and bust industrial disputes. So because of that, Labor lost a lot of that momentum, that mobilisational power it had in the lead up to 2014, which of course undercuts its ability to influence candidates in the election.
Thank you. So unionists, as you've said, have expressed some disappointment in Jokowi's failure to deliver on labour issues in his first term. And do you think they'll hold him to account in the 2019 elections? If you look into your crystal ball?
I think we can already answer that one. So in 2014, we had one of the three main confederations supporting Prabowo, and the other two supported Jokowi. The ones that supported Jokowi had a nice little reward at the end of that. The leaders of both those confederations got very cushy positions on the commissaries of some state-owned enterprises. So there's a lot less impetus for them to criticise his policies. Also, some within those unions have said to me in interviews, well, we supported him. It's not our job to criticise him. That should be the job of the other union that supported Prabowo, which of course has been criticising Jokowi a lot. But it was very clear from May Day last year, May Day 2018, where the unions were going to fall. The two confederations that supported Jokowi in the last election came out for Jokowi without any criticism of what had happened, even though in private they admit that there have been problems. And the confederation that supported Prabowo came out for Prabowo without pushing Prabowo for further engagement on that side. So Prabowo has again signed a list of 10 demands, a Labor platform of 10 demands, and it appears that he's also promised the head of that confederation the Ministry of Labour, which was also the case in 2014. So there are incentives on that side too. But in terms of actual holding to account on policy issues, it's quite disappointing for me that the confederations that supported Jokowi have not followed through as a friendly critic of his performance in that role.
And just quickly, the final question is, what do you think a Prabowo victory would mean for the unions in Indonesia, especially given his human rights record, and why does this matter?
Okay, this is an interesting question, right? If you talk to the confederation that supports him, which is the most energetic of the largest confederations, the confederation that's had the most success in both policy and workplace terms, they're very optimistic. They think they can manage the situation, especially if their leader is made Minister of Manpower. They've got this commitment on paper. But as we know, commitments in a pre-election period have to be tested in the real world. No one thinks that Prabowo is going to win at this stage, but should he win, I think it would put that confederation in a very difficult situation. They'd have to really find a way to try to hold him to account, and if he didn't, as could be expected, follow through on those promises, it is possible that it would actually catalyse a mass mobilisation on the streets as we saw in 2013, 2014.
Thank you, Michelle. Over to you now, Anthony. What changes have taken place regarding the fulfilment of the rights of people with disability and mental illness in Indonesia? particularly their rights to political participation?
Okay, thank you so much, Simon. This is a very interesting question. I think the most visible change in regards to the fulfillment of the rights of persons with disability in Indonesia is the emergence of um, legislation and policies that are based on the rights or human rights framework, and also that promotes disability inclusion. And I think this also has to do with the commitment of the Indonesian government to adopt the global agenda, like the ratification of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals agenda for 2030 that promotes inclusion of people with disability in all aspects of development. And one of the implementation of the ratification of the UNCRPD is the enactment of the first Indonesian disability rights-based law, law number 8 on 2016, on penyandang disabilitas or persons with disability. So unlike the previous disability law, this law covers all human rights of people with disability in all aspects of life, like social, economic, culture, including politics. So in terms of political participation, and of course, people with disability, regardless of their impairments, including people with mental illness, of course, are guaranteed by the law, to vote as well as to get elected, either as a parliamentarian candidates as well as to sit in the state official position like mayors, governors, or even presidents. I think there is a bit of increase in the participation based on the data from the Electoral Commission, KPU, that compared to the participation of the people in last year local general elections, from 500,000 people now, it just doubled from to 1.2 million people that are already registered in the DPT or the permanent voters list. And I think it is a great thing to see. But of course, this number is far smaller than the total number of people with disability in Indonesia that is estimated around 21 million people based on the intercensal population survey conducted by the GPS. And I'm really excited also to see that for this year's election, there are about 35 people with disability are now participating to be elected as the parliamentarian candidate in several provinces in Indonesia. And I think previous election was like only a handful of them, like 5 or 6. But this year there are 35 of them. And I think we can see that for disabled people, politics is also an interesting arena to get into. Particularly for people with mental illness, as I said, that of course their rights are fully guaranteed by the law, but there's a sort of pros and cons in the participation of people with mental illness among the society. I think this most likely because of the lack of awareness or knowledge of the society about this issue. I think some people might take it a joke that why orang gila should participate in the election. so maybe they think like some people with mental illness in the street, something like that. But the regulation of KPU also has provided some what do you call that, accessibility for them. They also have amended some controversial regulation before that. The candidates who have like some problem with their mental illness are not allowed to participate, and so they have to require medical certificate for that. But those two regulations are already amended. There's no more, and people with mental illness will be able to participate, of course. But the number of people with mental illness registered to participate only 3,500. It is also a very small number in comparison to the total number of people with mental illness, like 500,000 people in Indonesia.
Thank you. And what do you think the extent of or to what extent do you think disability and inclusion have been addressed in the policy platforms of both candidates? And will this be a significant issue in the elections?
Yeah, great question. Okay, I think in the platforms of both presidential candidates, be it Indonesia Maju of the incumbent or Indonesia MENA, which is the device platform of the Prabowo Sandi, I cannot see that disability is a priority yet. For example, in Jokowi's platform of Indonesia Maju, because there are, I think, 9 salient points there, and I thought that disability inclusion would be in the first point, which is human development. But I cannot really see disability getting mentioned there. The same happens also to the what do you call that? Platform of Prabowo Sandi. You know, there is no mentioning of disability in their platform as well. But interestingly, in their debates, both of the candidates touched a little bit on disability inclusion. For example, Jokowi in his first debate mentioned that there's had been a paradigm shift from approaching disability from charity to rights-based approach. And then he gave the example of disability inclusion and giving the same or equal amount of money prize to the Asian Games medalists with or without disability. And I think inclusion does not necessarily mean equality, because disabled people are very heterogeneous and they have very highly different types and levels of needs. And I think inclusion can sometimes mean differential treatment. Yeah, it depends on their needs. And Sandiaga also talked about providing employment opportunities through quota system, but I think this is not any approach. And there have been some studies around this that show that this approach is less effective. But as I said before, that because Indonesia stated their commitment to the fulfillment of the rights of persons with disability, I think whoever the president will be elected, so they have to keep committing, their efforts in realizing the rights of persons with disability.
Good. We might move on to Jeff Nielsen now, who's representing the Environment and Resources Cluster. Jeff, Indonesia, of course, faces an array of environmental challenges. But to what extent are these challenges concerns in the political realm? How are they going to play out in the Indonesian elections?
Yeah. I mean, Indonesia, of course, has some of the world's most extensive rainforests, right in the heart of the so-called Coral Triangle. It's a mega diverse country, and so it's globally important in that regard. It also faces various challenges in relation to deforestation, coral reef destruction, etc. And I think it's probably fair to say that conservation issues themselves are not really at the forefront of debates, political debate within Indonesia at the moment. It haven't been really throughout the campaign so far. If you look at the formal policy platform documents, there's sort of very little space that's afforded to environmental issues, apart from, I guess, simple lines like reduce transport emissions or prevent forest fires. There's very little really in the way of policy in the documents themselves. I think it's one page out of maybe 40, 50 page policy documents. Which is not to say it's not important amongst, like, I guess, some of the urban middle class and the younger voters who increasingly do see it as an issue, but I don't think it's really grabbed the attention of the broader electorate. The second, they have these televised debates they had. The second debate back in February was themed around energy, resource and the environment, I think. And most people would say that the environment was very much the poor cousin of that debate. There was very little discussion about major issues such as plastic pollution in the oceans, which is a major problem in Indonesia. Very little was discussed about climate change even, with the exception, I think, both candidates saying they were going to be promoting biofuel use, which sort of in Indonesia is code for palm oil, and with very little understanding of the fact that, of course, palm oil plantations could be resulting in their own environmental problems through deforestation. I guess the most memorable part, of that televised debate was Jokowi bringing up the fact that Prabowo has something like 300,000 hectares of his own palm oil plantations or leases in his name in places like East Kalimantan and Aceh, and which sort of, serve for Jokowi's purposes of distinguishing Prabowo and his access to land with his own sort of, one of the more significant environmental policies that Jokowi enacted was a moratorium on all new palm oil plantations on forestry land. And so he sort of created that distinction, between himself as something a bit more progressive and Prabowo, who owned 300,000 hectares. And I think most important, in a strategic sense in Indonesia, even though conservation itself might not be a major political issue, people have a very strong sense, I think, of uneven or inequitable access to natural resources. So the environment is framed as a question of getting access to natural resources. So highlighting 300,000 hectares of land against average agricultural holdings of less than 1 hectare sort of serve to highlight that inequitable access.
Although, to be fair, Jokowi did earn a living running a furniture shop, selling wooden products as well. Elections in Indonesia are increasingly contests of nationalism. And how is this playing out in the natural resources space?
Well, as I say, I think the environment is really framed politically as an issue of access to natural resources. So it makes sense to then think of who's accessing Indonesia's natural resource wealth, who's accessing minerals, who's accessing fisheries, forestry, land, etc. So it's not too much of a leap then to realise, well, really it should be Indonesians primarily that are benefiting from, and not unreasonably so, benefiting from the natural resource wealth of the country. And so the debates often emerge around, excluding foreign access to resources, and this leads to what's often referred to as resource nationalism. I guess it's been most evident in say the mining sector. After years of protracted negotiations, and Freeport, the massive gold and copper mine in Papua province, has often been the litmus test for how Indonesia is going in terms of managing its mining sector. It's a massive mine. And even though for years now, foreign mining companies are supposed to have divested all their interests to majority Indonesian holdings, it took 4 or 5 years of negotiation between Freeport and the government to finally result in the divestiture agreements that I think were concluded late last year. So Jokowi can look at that and say, okay, we now have a majority ownership of the Freeport mine. It's a majority owned by Indonesian Holdings, the state-owned mining company in Alum now owns 51%, and they paid a pretty penny for it. They paid $3.5 billion for that share, and of course many people are wondering whether they've purchased a fantastic resource, but they also probably purchased a pretty serious environmental liability as well. But these issues, but who can access mineral wealth, is certainly playing out in such a way, I think, to Jokowi's benefit last year, and that was certainly raised during the recent debates. I guess the other issue would be food security and food sovereignty, and the need for Indonesia to produce more food than it imports. And even though both candidates are very, very strong on the rhetoric of being swasembada pangan and swasembada energy and all the rest of it, in the debate, interesting, Jokowi tended to soften a little bit in his stance and had a bit more of we need imports at certain stages of rice to ensure that caps kept on inflation.
Around 40% of all Indonesian households are engaged in agriculture or fisheries, which of course is a considerable voting bloc. how successfully does this group mobilise politically in Indonesia?
Well, not unlike, I think, the situation with the unions in Indonesia, sort of the shadow of 1965 sort of has cast sort of made it very difficult for farmers and peasant organisations to mobilise across the country. The former Barisan Tani Indonesia being involved in the unilateral actions of land reform back in the 60s, and anyone advocating too strongly on this front can be very quickly labelled a communist. So it's a very difficult area for organisations to mobilise within. During the Suharto era, there was the HKTI, the Himpunan Kerukunan Tani Indonesia, which was actually chaired by Prabowo during the 1990s for a period as an attempt to mobilise the farmer vote. He's since no longer the chairman, but more, and in fact the HKTI now is formally supporting the Jokowi candidature, and probably some of the more progressive post-reformasi organisations like the Serikat Petani Indonesia are also supporting once again Jokowi's nomination. They sort of base that on the general improvement of lives of farmers and his apparent commitment to land reform since then. So the question, I guess, becomes whether farmers actually vote according to the dictates of these organisations. I think for the most part, the answer to that is probably no. There's no agricultural political party in Indonesia as such, and they're probably more likely to vote in allegiance with patronage networks, religious organisations, or cultural groups.
Thank you, Jeff. We might move on to Russell now, economic and social development. When Jokowi was elected in 2014, he made some key economic promises, including pushing the economic growth rate to 7% annually, cutting fuel subsidies, and massively increasing investments in infrastructure. How did his government go on these?
Thanks, Simon, and thanks for having me. On the growth rate, they never reached that goal. The economic growth rate pinged between about 4.7 and 5.3%, which on a global scale is still fantastic. Indonesia is well on track to be one of the top 5 global economies in the next 10 or 15 years in purchasing power parity terms, but they never really got close to that 7% rate. On the fuel subsidies, Jokowi was really lucky. The global oil price crashed massively just after he was elected, and so they were able to cut back fuel subsidies, but that wasn't a very painful thing to do. In the last couple of years leading up to the election, knowing that oil prices are a point of sensitivity for Indonesians, they've started stabilizing the oil price again and trying to control prices at the tap. So it's just been too risky in the lead up to the election not to do that. And on infrastructure, as Michelle mentioned, broadly, there's been some impressive work. That was a really high priority for Jokowi's government. They had over 200 strategic projects, of which a couple dozen have been finished and dozens more have been started. There's definitely been criticism by Prabowo and others at how the procurement was done on those, but there has been some success on the infrastructure front, and I think Jokowi's mainly looking to just kind of complete that schedule of work if he's re-elected.
And Jokowi's government also wanted to reduce poverty and inequality through redistributive programs. And how successful do you think those efforts were?
So I'd say, broadly speaking, Jokowi's government largely continued a lot of the big programs that were there under the previous government, the SPA government, and we did see some small reductions in poverty, although that's been a very stubborn number, moving from maybe about 11.5% in 2011 to just under 10% now. So there have been reductions in poverty, but they've been very slow. On the inequality front, last year it was reported that the 4 richest men in Indonesia own as much as the 100 million poorest people in Indonesia, and Indonesia's top 10 in the world in inequality. There's been some downward movement there, but I think the consensus among economists is that was mainly due to improvements for the middle class. The poorest of the poor, those who are in poverty, still aren't getting the majority of the help there.
And of course, to roll out some of these social programs to reduce poverty and inequality, the government needs quite a bit of revenue. Jokowi's Finance Minister Sri Mulyani was working hard on this, notably through tax reforms and even a tax amnesty program. How do you think these worked out?
Yeah, so this is a really critical issue because all the other stuff that the government would like to do is a function of how much fiscal space they have, how much revenue they have to spend. Sri Mulyani moved back to Indonesia from the World Bank, and she's been working hard on that. And if you talk, at least in the donor community, among World Bank officials, DFAT, they're talking all about the social contract in Indonesia, getting a larger proportion of the population, especially the elites, to pay their share. Some work I've done recently looks at people's willingness to pay tax in Indonesia and to fight inequality. And what we find is that people underestimate inequality. They'd like to reduce it, but they don't necessarily trust the government to do that through redistributive programs. So in terms of Sri Mulyani and her finance ministry's efforts on the tax side, there was a major tax amnesty program in 2016-17, and she herself said it was disappointing. They got about an extra 1 million people registered on the tax rolls, but in a country where only about 35 million of the 165 million adults are registered, that wasn't a huge increase, even though 1 million is still a great progress. There was a big identification of overseas assets beyond what the government had targeted, but there's still a lot to be done on this front. And the newest effort is the OECD has started an automatic exchange of information initiative that allows governments to share information about overseas assets, and Indonesia is aggressively trying to take advantage of that program. Dozens of countries have already shared information with the Indonesian government about overseas assets of Indonesian citizens, and that might be a tool to help them collect the taxes that are due. So,
very complicated process, though. Now, in this current election race, each candidate team has a member with a very strong but very different business background. So Jokowi himself, a small business owner, but on the other side, Sandiaga Uno is one of the richest people in Indonesia, one of the top 50 richest people in Indonesia. Does this mean that the economic platforms of the two candidate teams have focused on different issues? Has the Joko Macruf team focused on small business, but Prabowo and Sandiago on larger businesses?
I think that's probably too simplistic of a view. I think probably on one level strategically, the Prabowo Sandi team has kind of tried to not overemphasize Sandiago Uno's background, and to some extent there's kind of an assumption that he would be strong on entrepreneurship, and investment, access to finance for businesses. So I think they've been somewhat balanced there. I think the Jokowi Maruf platform is clearer. I think Jokowi kind of sees that he's already started this infrastructure program and is just looking to kind of finish it out rather than to set ambitious new targets there. And instead, they've been focusing more on expanding the digital economy, and both sides have actually been focused on the Islamic economy. So expanding entrepreneurship programs in Islamic schools. That was an idea that Sandiaga Uno had as deputy governor of Jakarta, and the Jokowi team has kind of matched that. And there's also been quite a lot of attention actually in Jokowi's team to the digital economy going forward.
Well, that raises the question of staying competitive as new technologies emerge. Obviously, there are some opportunities such as the digital economy, but also some challenges such as automation of jobs. How would you contrast how the candidate teams are addressing these issues?
Yeah, I would say that I find the approach of Jokowi and Maruf to be more progressive on these issues. If I look at the overall economic approach between the two candidate teams, I find that the Prabowo and Sandi's approach is a bit more nationalistic and involving government interference, and I think Jokowi's team is more kind of pushing private sector initiatives, enabling special economic zones and these kind of efforts.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. We might move on to you, Intan, and heritage and the arts. How will the outcome of the election affect women and LGBT groups?
Yeah, thank you. So it is clear that both candidates have limited, if not embarrassing, understanding of gender and sexuality issues. So both mobilize women to support them for their political agenda. For instance, Prabowo Sandiaga Uno team used the term emak-emak, or which is associated with militant working class mothers, but there's no militancy in the program at all. Basically, women's aspiration is understood as, you know, the stability of prices. So keep the economic stability to make women and families happy. And Jokowi Ma'ruf they use the term Ibu Bangsa, or mothers of the nation, which is very Suharto-esque. In general, both commodify women's voices without making a clear, meaningful attempt to link to feminist activist groups. There is no clear commitment to support the sexual violence eradication bill. So whoever wins the election, what will continue is the stigmatization of two groups. The first one is the feminist groups, and the second one, the LGBT group. So there has been a strong anti-feminist sentiment in the past few years. Conservative women groups have claimed that feminists threaten traditional family values. But what is more worrying is the vulnerable position of LGBT people. And we know that since 2016, anti-LGBT campaigns have gotten worse. There were persecutions from 2017 to 2018. There were 300 people arrested for their sexual orientation, convicted under the pornography law. So it can be predicted that after the election, it will be very challenging still for LGBT discourses. And also feminist discourses, regardless who the president is. Jokowi might seem to be more progressive, but we know that he did nothing to protect minority rights, and he chose Ma'ruf Amin as his running mate, even though Ma'ruf Amin issued a fatwa against LGBT people.
Well, you almost answered the next question, which was someone who works with feminist groups in the field of arts and culture. What changes have we seen, if any, during the Jokowi administration in terms of government support for the arts and freedom of expression?
Yeah, the support is in the form of economic support, and that coexists with maneuvers that are pro-censorship. So in terms of the support, we can observe two things. First, there are spaces to negotiate, because a lot of the activists, not a lot, some activists from the 98 generation, they work with the government, within the government's institution. For instance, the Director General of Culture and Education, Hilmar Farid, who is really part of the cultural network, and he is open to conversations of what issues are salient in the field, in arts and culture, and what requires support. And his team actually successfully lobbied Jokowi to allocate a trust fund of I have to check my 5 trillion rupiah to support arts and culture. And then second, there's heightened visibility of neoliberal experiments in creative industry. Creative industry means that arts and creativity are framed in economic terms as national and international commodities. It was under Jokowi that Bekraf was established, and Bekraf is Indonesian agency for creative economy. They provide funding for the arts, and the latest project was this huge project. They participated in the London Book Fair as the market-focused country, and I can talk more about that if anyone is interested. It is a performance of the state in terms of creative industry, but there are some traces of the New Order regime as well. But you know, in addition to support, or despite the support, The laws are still very punitive. So this is shown through the latest music bill, for instance, that contains articles that prohibit artists to create materials that provoke and agitate. For instance, dealing with sensitive issues such as ethnicity and religion. And the articles are very much similar to those that we can find in, let's say, the film law, in the 2009 film law. Basically, in these laws, the artists are not treated as citizens that can contribute to the civic life, but they are framed as provocateurs or even criminals. And the audience is infantilized as uninformed masses, easily provoked masses. And of course, we inherit this from the New Order regime. And I could say that with the emphasis on censorship, the laws regulating arts and culture are very similar to pornography law, blasphemy law, and also the ITE law, or the Information and Electronic Transaction law that regulates the internet.
Speaking of censorship, do you think if if Prabowo wins, censorship in the arts will worsen, will get worse?
It might get worse because Prabowo has courted the Islamic hardliners, and he seems to be committed to promote conservative Islamic agenda if he wins. However, censorship is already rampant under Jokowi's administration. So, for instance, last month, a sociology professor was arrested because he sang a song that criticized the military, and he was threatened with the ITE law. And this is just one of so many cases that led people to question Jokowi's integrity to support democratic freedom. In terms of censorship in the arts, usually what gets censored is the art forms with higher visibility. So, art forms that are too elitist, or art forms that are, within the independent theater production, they could be very limited in terms of circulation and visibility. But popular music, film, and TV, they might suffer from censorship. And if Jokowi wins the election, conservative groups will try harder to use morality issues as political tool. And unfortunately, it seems that Jokowi will try to comply with conservative narratives, whether these narratives come from the Muslim conservatives or from the military, because he has been working really hard to make these groups happy.
Thank you very much. That's all we have from our panelists. Would you please join me in thanking them for answering all of my questions? Now we have a little bit of time for questions and answers to the panelists, or from the panelists, questions to them. We might take three at a time.
Okay, I'm going to clump them.
Yep.
Hands first.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a fantastic talk already. I have a question for Anthony and for Russell about the new universal healthcare scheme. Universal healthcare schemes are one of the fantastic tools to redistribute wealth. Now, the scheme has met some issues with some fine-tuning. I would like to hear your opinion about what you think is going to happen there.
Thank you.
Hi, also thank you for a fantastic panel discussion. So there have been allegations by the Prabowo camp. There are millions of voters that are ghost voters on the Indonesian electoral roll, and the Prabowo team is saying if the elections don't go their way, they'll go out into the streets and launch a challenge to the Indonesian Constitutional Court. How seriously are voters taking these allegations, and do you think that these threats of mass protests, do you think they might actually eventuate if the election doesn't go their way? Thank you.
Who is that question directed?
Anyone who feels comfortable.
We'll just leave it at that.
There's one up the back.
Oh, there's one more. Yeah.
Thank you to all the speakers. I guess I've got a double-barreled question. I was reading in Al Jazeera about there are growing groups of people, particularly minorities, LGBTI, progressives, who are talking about goal puts, like deliberately voting informal. So I'm just wondering if anyone can comment on how significant that might be. The other thing I wanted to ask, because I'm part of the Refugee Action Coalition here, and it's obviously a major issue between Australia and Indonesia. 2 years ago, Jokowi signed a decree giving sort of refugee status other than illegal migrants. So I'm just wondering whether that has, if anyone can answer this, I'm not sure, has changed the status of those, say, 14,000, 15,000 who've been stranded in Indonesia for quite a while as a result of Australia's policies. Yeah, we're obviously campaigning for Australia to lift its ban on resettlement of those people. But while they're in Indonesia, just wondering whether their status has changed as a result of that.
All right, who wants to go first? Anthony?
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I think for the JKN, we know that JKN was not born out of during President Jokowi's administration, but JKN deficit is reflecting poorly during the Jokowi's leadership. And the main problem is JKN is spending money that it doesn't have. And unfortunately, during the previous debates, especially for the last debate of the vice president candidates, they do not really show the clear actions that they're going to do in regards to this deficit. For example, Maruf Amin only talk about they're going to continue this program, but he didn't really touch on what is the main problem of this JKN and also the main problem of this BPJS as the organizer of the scheme. And then Sandiaga only talked about preventive measures, like you have to do physical exercise 22 minutes to get healthy, so you don't have to see doctors and you will save government's money. And yeah, he also talked about doing some calculation by involving financial expert or something like that, so they will know exactly what is the per capita cost of each what do you call that, recipient of this check, but it's still not clear how he's going to do that. Yeah, so I think if there is no clear mechanism for the government to ensure that they can expand the funding for the JKN, or they can find funding sources for this, and then JKN will remain rely continually on the state budget, either whoever is going to be elected there.
Thank you. Russell, do you want to add something?
Yeah, that's a really good background on it. The problem is that the government's providing heavily subsidized healthcare to 100 million lower income people, which is great, but a lot of the salaried workers aren't, they're underreporting their taxes, so they're not kind of cross subsidizing the program. So as Anthony said, it's really a question of a gap in funding, and it gets back to this issue of the social contract of getting the better off people to increase government revenues and be able to support these kinds of social programs.
I might answer your question about the potential for unrest or people running out onto the streets after the election results. I'm taken back to the last elections where similar threats were made, I think, or similar kind of fears were held, and it just didn't eventuate. The reason that most people give for that was that the processes of the Constitutional Court were largely respected, and so there was little kind of debate, little kind of challenge after the court said no. There may have been a bit of manipulation in the vote count, but not enough to change the result. And at that point, the Constitutional Court, I think, had enough credibility to be able to say that. There's been one of the judges again convicted for corruption since that time. But I can't see why the court and its decisions won't be respected again, because it gives at least the appearance of objectivity in these types of cases. I've seen the statements, people like Amin Reis coming out and suggesting that people power will kind of take hold if the election results don't go the way that he and others are expecting. But I would be very surprised to see that happening. There's also we have, I think it's fair to say, an improved Bawaslu committee, the supervisory board for the elections that oversee how the Electoral Commission is performing its functions, refer cases to the Constitutional Court and the like. I think in terms of professionalism I think they've improved over the past few years too. So I hope I'm not proved wrong, but I would be very surprised to see any serious unrest as a result.
I wouldn't mind speaking a bit about the converse of that, and that's the fact that many Indonesians can't vote because they don't live where they're registered. This is a very big problem among migrant workers, internal migrant workers in industrial zones, where their KTP, their identity card's still back in the village, and they live in an industrial centre. And there have been measures, certainly in the 2014 elections, where large-scale employers would give their workers some time off around the election so that they didn't vote if they were registered in the region, but also really actively made it difficult for workers to register. So I think there's two sides of that question, and hopefully it's being cleaned up with electronic KTP and various other means, but I think it's likely to be an ongoing problem for some time.
So maybe I can comment on golput or the non-voters. So the non-voters, they're actually a small group, but they're allowed. And it's important for them to express their political stance publicly and through social media as a form of protest because they're disillusioned by Jokowi. They think that Jokowi doesn't protect minority rights and he has no commitment in supporting human rights or feminist issues. So this group is, a lot of people in this group actually voted for Jokowi in 2014 due to sort of emergency reasons. And I wrote an article in the Jakarta Post about the rhetoric of emergency activism. This is a term that I borrowed from scholar Melanie Budianta. It is activism that characterizes a lot of activist work in Indonesia. It's based on emergency situation, very spontaneous, and also ephemeral. So, it lives and dies very quickly. So back then, the election was perceived as an emergency case because people did not want to have a president with horrible human rights violation record, and therefore the only option was to choose Jokowi. And people were actually they were not really sure about Jokowi, but he was at least clean, and he did not have any relation to the elite circles, or so it seemed. And right now, everything is very different, of course. So back then, it was really about polarization, and that caused emergency situation. Either you are this or that. But right now, we need to question whether there's this polarization if Jokowi is also supported by military men who conducted horrible human rights violations. So this is, the same people who back then voted for Jokowi. They weren't really certain about Jokowi, but they voted anyway because of emergency activism. And now they publicly state their political stance as GoFood. So they're very small actually, but they want to make sure that it's loud.
Thank you. Yes, one. Oh, here we go.
I think we still have the question up the back about.
Yeah, I'm not sure
I'm
any
not
of
sure
us are
we
in a
can-
position. to
Yeah,
answer
Okay,
it,
no,
sorry.
unfortunately, sorry about that.
Okay, so we've got a question here.
Thank you. So my question is that it seems that this election has been highlighting a lot of the disenfranchisement with the political realities and structures that have emerged since 1998. And so my question is there any indication that looking beyond this election, that something else could develop as an alternative to these constellations of political and economic power?
A question for Intan in regard to the Indonesian market focus at the London Book Fair. Is it already known how successful it was? I know it in terms of promoting Indonesian literature in general, it was, but in sales of Indonesian books to foreign markets?
Thank you. This is probably for everyone. Back in 2014, Jokowi then had a war on drugs right after he won the election. How likely, and the moratorium on the death penalty was lifted. How likely do you think something like this, another effort to gain support either from, I guess, domestic forces, but also kind of asserting power with international audiences? How likely do you think that will happen this time around with either Jokowi or Prabowo? Thanks.
Who's next?
That's three.
Well, there's this one over here. that we should take. There it is.
Coming.
None of them really for us.
Hi, I'm not really sure who this question can go in particular. Interesting quote from Elizabeth Pisani about the idea of how you can prevent, the issue of both illegal drug trafficking and the military underfunding and all sorts of things and the health stuff is to actually triple the military budget by actually in a way to actually reduce the actual drug trafficking issue as well as the illegal sex trade and whatever stuff that unfortunately the issue of refugees stuck in Indonesia are also being part of, because under the Bali process that's actually another complicated stuff. Now, what is your position on Indonesia's anybody can actually explain the issue of that transparency, especially when it comes to illegal trafficking and trades, because it covers so much of these issues that we're going to ask.
Because you got a direct question.
Yeah, maybe we can start with the fun part first, which is the London Book Fair, and I was there as one of the authors. It was, well, the government would frame this narrative as, yeah, this is still a process, but they actually sold less than they targeted. It was only 23 books, and there were, hundreds, but there are still, it's a bit unclear whether, it's going to be a deal or not. But can I add a little bit? I would say that part of the reason is that, there's so much money invested in this London Book Fair affair. So much money, but the problem is they did not focus on the books or how to frame the books or how to strengthen the network, the position of authors and publishers, agents in the market. Rather, I think a lot of money went to the creation of spectacles. So it was about the spectacles, which was kind of eerie because it reminded me of the Suharto kind of approach in dealing with any kinds of international events, it's always spectacular. So, it was very luxurious. We could see a lot of, it's like an Indonesia in miniature park, like Ibutin Suharto's project, where you could see, Indonesian coffee, Indonesian batik, and the traditional and the modern. So it's a spectacle of culture within this cute little bubble called mini Indonesia. But it is really not about targeting the market. That's an interesting way of performing creative industry, but still in the kind of Suharto-esque way.
Maybe next question about the potential for alternatives. I think we've got to remember that Jokowi, of course, came in 5 years ago as the ultimate outsider, the small guy, the person who was outside of the political elites at the time. And so in some ways that was, as minimal as it looks now in retrospect, that was the moment of sort of significant change, I think. And the reality, of course, is the various kinds of horse trading that's required to stay in power, which I think, for the most part, Jokowi has been relatively effective at, whilst at the same time minimising the inevitable dependency he's going to have on political parties and on the other economic elites in the country, the oligarchs, without pushing it too far, because, quite frankly, if he did try to push it too far, he would get kicked out. And so I think it's a matter of a pragmatic approach within the reality of existing political economy within Indonesia that he has to negotiate. I think in terms of those that are disappointed with all the golputs and the people saying there's no real alternative here, they're all much for muchness, I would say I think Jokowi has managed, certainly in agrarian affairs, there has been some real advances in terms of access to resources, in terms of access to fisheries, in terms of access to forest lands, adult forest law, social forestry schemes, and also the moratorium in that area. Organisations like fairly radical organisations like SPE, I feel as if there has been progress, albeit quite slow, in those areas. So whether any sort of radical alternative is likely to appear in the next 5 years, I don't see it. I'm not sure even whether that would necessarily be a good thing, because there'd be the strong reactionary force within Indonesia would probably make it quite destabilising.
I'd like to speak to that a bit before I take the other question. I think I agree with everything that Jeff said, but at the same time, I think too it's important not to fetishize the oligarchy of Indonesia, as some scholars do. If you think about the way that politics works in the US or in many other countries in the world, Indonesia is not so different in the role that the very rich play in electoral politics. The other thing I think we shouldn't understate is how dynamic the Indonesian political scene has been since '98. Obviously the example of Jokowi being able to rise to president, but even without that, the way that different candidates have emerged, how different parties have coalesced. There are many examples where parties did not follow the line that oligarchs would like them to follow. The fact that Prabowo did accept the court decision last time and not challenge the result, which could have been really a crisis point for Indonesian democracy. So I think we all accept that the very rich in Indonesia, as in many countries, have an important political role. But I think it's also important to look at that mid-level, meso-level politics and look at just how dynamic that has been. And it's not unusual for democracies to have all these dynamics, and for sometimes it to look less democratic than others, including in Australia. So I think it's important to remember that. I want to speak briefly about the military question. As most of you would know, the structure of the Indonesian military for many decades has been such that only a small proportion of its budget is provided from the state budget. The military has always been required to seek other forms of finance for its everyday activities. Now, the problem is once you do that, once you make that part of how a military or any organisation works, including civil servants in Indonesia, where do you draw the line then? If you've already passed the absolute line, then the limit is really wherever there's no limit. So I think in many ways we need to understand the engagement of the military in illicit activities as part of this particular political economy of the Indonesian civil service. Sorry? No, exactly. But you mentioned the military, and I think it's interesting because I did a research project a number of years ago on the Rio Islands, and of course there the Navy is the primary player. And if you look at illicit flows across that borderlands, basically if you forget about the Navy, you've lost the whole picture. It's all about the Navy. And of course there are other areas in Indonesia, other borders, other places where different arms of the military have that same role. So I think, yes, Sri Mulyani tried to deal with this in some parts of the government. It didn't work out so well. I think it is an ongoing cultural problem with a political economic base that will continue to haunt Indonesia for many decades. Okay, sorry, death penalty.
Yeah, death penalty. I don't have that much to say, except to again go back to the circumstances in which Jokowi started his war on drugs, when he was quite politically weak. He did not form or had not formed the relatively strong parliamentary coalitions that he enjoys nowadays, and was, I think, in need of a project, something to be seen to be firm about. And once he made this pledge, it didn't come across as particularly well planned to me, to start executing drug offenders for war on drugs. He then, in order to maintain this kind of firmness that he wanted to portray, needed to follow through, at least with some executions. But I'm not sure whether there's been much talk about the death penalty in the lead up to the current elections. So I can't see much else changing.
Just to add to that, I mean, you have to remember that in 2014, Prabowo was playing very much on his strongman image, and Jokowi needed some kind of foil to that. If you think about the landscape of the debate for this election, it's all shifted to the right, and both sides are very much claiming both the nationalist and the Islamist territory. So I wonder whether that has reduced the need for those sorts of performance of strongman tactics from the Jokowi camp. And I think, Prabowo would have enough else that he wanted to do if he was elected to not go there, but hopefully that's right.
Yeah. Any further questions? No. 5 minutes.
Thank you, panel, for very interesting discussion. I spend a lot of time on the weekend watching public debates on YouTube from different Indonesian television stations. One thing that's really quite intriguing and very glaring for me is the absence of women experts. There are, in a lot of cases, you get a panel of men, even though, a very well-respected public figure like Najwa Shihab is, a woman leader, and we have women leaders in all sectors. Where are they? What's wrong with the television industry such that these women experts are not called in, especially, in the lead up towards election? Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much. When from Australia we look at the Indonesian political process, I think a lot of the time we look at it through concerns about growing or continuing illiberalism in the Indonesian system. Just wondering, is there anywhere in the Indonesian political ecology, if you like, that there is mileage in pursuing more progressive liberal agendas? Why would anybody?
I think you mentioned human rights, migrants, women. But we forget to mention the Indonesian Constitution, Undang-Undang Dasar 1945 and Pancasila. In one of the debates held, I think about 2 weeks ago, both the president and the Salam president agreed that the Pancasila and Undang-Undang Dasar has got to be taught primary school level all the way up to university. So there must be a problem there. We just accept that we have a constitution, and when I voted at the last election, I voted without fear. So that's the same situation exists in Indonesia.
Just one more.
What is the role of foreign countries like China, USA, and Middle East in the layout of this pemilu? Thank you.
So maybe I can comment on Murphy's question, but I think it's a statement. It's a statement that really Indonesian television really ignores the fact that we have women experts, and this is really part of the mainstream culture, and it's not that we didn't do anything about it, because feminist groups have done a lot in making sure that this is a problem, that the mainstream culture's all male panel is the problem. So we create, we use the hashtag do you know this hashtag all male panels? And we would just put pictures of forums that ignore women. And usually this happens in many economic, law, what else? Religion panels. Although this happens in literature as well, and I noticed this because I'm really in the field.
Maybe if I could just add to that.
Yeah.
This is a very male-heavy panel for a SEAC panel. Sometimes we have a diversity problem the other way. But the comment I wanted to make is about Indonesian universities, which are no better than the media.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many times I've seen an all-male lineup at a university seminar in Indonesia, unless it's on women's issues. So I'm not sure that it's just the television, yeah?
Yeah. No, it's part of the mainstream culture. This because women's expertise is not being taken seriously. And then what a lot of feminist activists have done, they don't always create one platform. So there are so many platforms. So one of them is HIFO's platform. It's called Women Unlimited or something. And there you could see women experts from various fields like religion or law or economics or environment. And then there's a bio for each person. But the question is, again, visibility and whether this could be accepted as part of the mainstream culture, because until now, feminists are still considered, either they're westernized or they are, they're basically just angry, ugly women, right? So it is a challenge, how to challenge, how to deconstruct this kind of patriarchal thinking. It's a challenge for all of us, but at the same time, we must admit that we feminists are in the counterpublic. We're not really part of the mainstream. Okay. That's bleak. Okay.
I'm not sure whether that was a question either. I must admit, I've done a lot of work on the Indonesian Constitution and tried to get my head around Pancasila for many, many years. And I've always found it a bit perplexing, because to me it means a number of things depending on who's asking the question. I didn't see the debate that you referred to, but are we talking about the rights of minorities in the whole? Are we talking about Islam, other religions? Are we talking about the unity of Indonesia above all other concepts? Pancasila is always, and Undang-Undang Dasar are always referred to as though they're self-evident at what they mean. But in my opinion, nothing could be quite further from the truth. It's always used as a as something that everyone should aspire to, but without explaining precisely what that is. And I don't think that's changed for a long time.
My question actually is the understanding of Pancasila and it's an amazing document that was produced almost 75 years ago.
Yes.
Any country would be proud to have such a document. But has it since been amended during the Porto Paro?
Yes. We might have to talk about this after the panel because we're running out of time. Did anyone want to address any further? Oh, Russell? No?
Yeah, I thought I'd briefly speak to the foreign influence
question.
Not a political scientist, but I think a couple things that I find striking. One is the somewhat mixed relationship that Indonesia's had with China's Belt and Road initiative. As we all know, relationships with China are somewhat sensitive ground in Indonesia, and I think for a country that's been trying to massively expand infrastructure investment, it would have seemed to be a perfect marriage, and it hasn't been. There's been discussions, but it hasn't been full bore push like in some other countries. So I find that interesting. I think in terms of Prabowo's approach, it's a very nationalistic approach, and I think there's kind of in his rhetoric, there's lots of talk of avoiding foreign influence. So I think that's an area where it's kind of been in the shadows to some extent. And the third thing that I think is really interesting is that in the Prabowo Sandi platform, they talk about the Rohingya issue in Myanmar, which is another region where I do research, and Palestine and Indonesia. I think it's interesting that those kind of foreign policy issues are brought up in Indonesia during an election campaign. I think that's not typical. So.
I think, unfortunately, that is all we have time for this evening. Would you please help me thank once again our panelists for tonight. Oh, and there are drinks upstairs, so please help yourself.